He leaned in so close, I could smell his cologne, something cedar and clean, completely out of place in a room that smelled like wilting gardenias and humiliation. And he whispered 4 words that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my life. "Just pretend I'm the groom." And then, before I could breathe, before I could even process what was happening, he did something that made 200 people go completely, utterly silent. Not the polite quiet of a ceremony, the kind of silence that follows a car accident, the kind where everyone is holding their breath because they genuinely don't know what comes next. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the 29 years that came before it. My name is Diane Calloway. I'm 51 years old. I live in a suburb about 40 minutes outside of Washington, D.C., and for the last 2.5 decades, I've been a photographer. Not the kind that shoots birthday parties and awkward family portraits at the mall, though Lord knows I did plenty of that in my 20s when the rent still felt like a threat. I built something real, a studio, a reputation, a client list that took me 15 years of early mornings and ruined weekends and missed dinners to assemble. My work has been published. I've shot 3 gubernatorial inauguration events, a spread for Architectural Digest, and more nonprofit galas than I can count without looking at my portfolio wall. I'm telling you this not to brag. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I've handled difficult people and difficult situations my entire career. I once talked a drunk groomsman down from a chandelier at a black tie event in Georgetown. I am steady. I am practical. I am the person other people call when things go sideways, which makes what happened on that Saturday in July all the more devastating, because I didn't see any of it coming. Let me tell you about Garrett first. Garrett Finch and I met 29 years ago at a 4th of July cookout at a mutual friend's place in Silver Spring. He was 30 at the time, I was 22, and he had this way of listening to you talk that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. He was a financial consultant back then, just starting out, hungry in the way that ambitious men in their early 30s are hungry. We were inseparable within 6 weeks, married within 2 years. We bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Bethesda and spent the next 2.5 decades building what I genuinely believed was a good life. We didn't have children. That was a long road with a lot of grief attached to it, and it's not the story I'm telling right now. What I will say is that the absence of children pushed Garrett and me closer to each other in some ways and created a distance in others. We traveled. We poured ourselves into our work. We had dinner parties and neighborhood friendships and a shared vegetable garden in the backyard that Garrett complained about every spring and then obsessively tended every summer like clockwork for 20 years. I loved him. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came after, I loved the man I believed he was for a very long time. Now let me tell you about Terrence Holt. Terrence came into our lives about 11 years ago. He was Garrett's business partner, which, looking back, meant he was woven into the fabric of our daily existence in ways that were almost impossible to separate out. He had dinner at our house regularly. He came to our anniversary parties. When my mother had her hip replaced in 2018, Terrence sent flowers to the hospital with a handwritten note. He was the kind of person who remembered things: your coffee order, the name of your childhood dog, the year you graduated college. He had that same quality Garrett had when I first met him, that quality of making you feel seen. Terrence was also, as I would come to understand much later, extraordinarily skilled at using that quality as a weapon. But in July of this year, I didn't know any of that yet. In July of this year, I was standing in the dressing room of a venue called Whitmore Hall, a converted Victorian estate about 20 minutes from our house, all exposed brick and tall windows, and the kind of deliberate charm that costs about $14,000 to rent for a day. And I was wearing a cream silk dress that had taken me 4 months to find. We had renewed our vows once before, on our 20th anniversary. This was our 29th. Garrett had proposed the renewal himself in February over dinner at home. He'd set the table properly, lit actual candles, opened a bottle of Bordeaux we'd been saving since a trip to France in 2017. He'd looked at me across the table and said, "I want to do it again. I want to stand up in front of everyone and choose you again." I'd cried. I'm not ashamed of that. My best friend Claudette had flown in from Atlanta. My college roommate Priya was there with her husband. My studio manager, a sharp 29-year-old named Ren, who had become something like family to me over the past 4 years, was sitting in the third row. And seated near the back, because I had insisted on inviting him despite a mild internal debate I hadn't fully examined, was my employer, or rather, the man who had become my primary client and something close to a professional partner over the last 3 years. His name is Elliot Marsh. Elliot owns a real estate development company that operates across the Mid-Atlantic region. He's 47, divorced, and has a reputation in certain circles for being either brilliant or ruthless, depending on who you ask and what they wanted from him. He'd hired me initially to document the renovation of a historic property he was restoring in Alexandria. That project had turned into 4 more projects, and somewhere along the way, we developed the kind of working relationship that occasionally bled into genuine friendship. He was direct in a way I respected. He asked good questions. He showed up on time. I had invited him because it seemed natural. He'd met Garrett 6 times at various work events. It was a celebration, not an intimate gathering. 200 people were there. What was one more? I remember standing at the tall mirror in the dressing room, Claudette adjusting the back of my dress, Priya pressing a glass of champagne into my hand, and actually thinking, as a conscious thought, that I was happy. Not the fragile, performative happiness that sometimes passes for contentment when you've been with someone long enough to stop questioning it. Real happiness. The kind that feels earned. "You look incredible," Claudette said, and she meant it. Claudette has never told me a comfortable lie in 30 years of friendship. "I feel good," I said, and I did. The July heat was brutal outside, that thick, suffocating DC area humidity that makes the air feel like a wet towel pressed against your face. But the venue was air-conditioned, and the gardenias on the altar were still fresh, and I was about to walk toward the man I'd spent my adult life loving. Then Ren knocked on the dressing room door. She opened it about 6 inches, just enough to put her face in the gap, and the expression she was wearing was one I had never seen on her before. Ren is unflappable. I have watched her handle a lighting rig collapse at an outdoor shoot without raising her voice. She looked, in that moment, like someone had told her something she didn't have the words for. "Diane," she said, "can I talk to you for a second? Just you." Claudette and Priya exchanged a glance. I handed my champagne glass to Priya and stepped into the hallway. Ren closed the door behind her. The hallway was narrow and smelled like old wood and floral arrangements. She was holding her phone in both hands, screen down, like she was trying to decide whether to show it to me. "What is it?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "Garrett is not in the venue," she said. "I went to check on the timeline with the officiant, and he's not there. His groomsmen don't know where he is. His phone is going straight to voicemail." I remember the way the air in that hallway felt. Still. Pressurized somehow, the way it gets before a summer storm breaks. "He probably stepped outside," I said. "It's stuffy in there. He runs warm." "Diane," Ren's voice was very quiet. "Terrence is also not here. Terrence left about 40 minutes ago. One of the groomsmen saw them talking near the parking lot, and then they were both gone." I stood there in my cream silk dress in that narrow hallway, and I felt something cold move through my chest. Not panic, not yet. Something more like the moment before you understand what you're looking at, the half-second before the image resolves. "Show me your phone," I said. She hesitated, then she turned it over. It was a text message. She'd received it from a number I didn't recognize, but the message was clearly meant to reach me through her. 3 sentences. I read them twice to make sure I hadn't misread them. "I won't be there, I'm sorry. Ask Terrence to explain, he knows everything." The gardenias near the altar were still fresh. 200 people were waiting in white wooden chairs. And my groom had just vanished from the parking lot of our vow renewal venue with his business partner on a sweltering Saturday in July. I walked back into the dressing room and I did not cry. I sat down in the chair in front of the mirror and I looked at my own face and I thought, there is something I don't know yet. There is something I have been standing next to for a very long time without seeing it clearly. And somewhere in that venue, in the third row from the back, Elliot Marsh was sitting in a gray linen suit, waiting for a ceremony that was not going to happen the way anyone expected. Claudette came out of the dressing room about 30 seconds after I sat down. She didn't ask. She just looked at my face in the mirror and then sat in the chair next to mine, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. "He sent a text," I finally said, "through Ren, to a number I don't recognize." Claudette's jaw tightened. "What did it say?" I told her, word for word, because I had already memorized it the way you memorize something that changes the shape of a room permanently. She was quiet for a beat that lasted too long. "Diane," she said, and her voice had that careful quality, the one she uses when she knows something she isn't sure she should say yet. "Whatever you're about to tell me," I said, "just say it." She exhaled. 6 weeks ago, Priya called me. She'd seen Garrett and Terrence having dinner at a restaurant in DuPont Circle, not a business dinner. She said it looked different. She didn't know how to describe it. She didn't want to say anything because she wasn't sure what she was seeing, and she didn't want to hurt you over something that might be nothing. I looked at my own reflection, the cream silk dress, the pearl earrings I'd borrowed from my mother, the gardenias pinned into my updo that were already starting to droop in the July heat, even inside the air conditioning. "She should have told me," I said. "I know. You should have told me." "I know that too." Claudette reached over and put her hand over mine on the vanity table. "I'm sorry. I genuinely didn't know what to do with secondhand uncertainty. That's not an excuse. I'm just telling you what happened." I didn't pull my hand away, but I didn't speak either. Priya knocked softly and came in. She looked like she'd been crying, which made one of us. I still hadn't. I wasn't sure if that was strength or if something in me had simply gone offline, the way a circuit breaker trips when the load gets too high. "Diane, I'm so sorry," she started. "I should have—" "I know," I said. "Claudette told me. We can talk about that later." I looked at both of them in the mirror. Right now, I need to think about 200 people sitting in white chairs on the other side of that door. What followed was the worst 45 minutes of my adult life. Not the most dramatic, not the loudest. The worst because it was quiet and administrative and relentlessly practical, the way disasters often are once the initial shock passes, and you're left with the logistics of what comes after. Ren coordinated with the venue manager, a polished woman named Sandra, who had clearly seen difficult events before, and handled this one with a kind of professional grace I will be grateful for indefinitely. The officiant was told, the caterer was told, the musicians, a string quartet that had been playing soft background pieces near the entrance, were quietly informed that the ceremony would not be proceeding as planned. I changed out of my dress in the dressing room. I put on the clothes I had arrived in, gray linen slacks, a white blouse, flat sandals. I folded the cream silk and laid it over the back of the chair, like it was something that had belonged to a different woman. I walked out into the main hall. 200 people know something is wrong before you say a word. They can feel it in the air, in the changed trajectory of the people moving around them, in the absence of the music that should have been building toward a processional. By the time I reached the front of the room, the murmuring had already started. I stood at the altar, the flower-covered arch that Garrett and I had chosen together from a vendor's catalog in April, and I looked out at all of those faces. I saw Claudette slip in at the back. I saw Priya standing near the side wall. I saw Ren in the third row, her expression controlled, but her eyes full of something I recognized as fury on my behalf. And I saw Elliot Marsh, 4 seats from the aisle, watching me with an attention that was completely still. "Thank you all for being here," I said. My voice was steady. I have no idea how. "I'm going to be direct with you because most of you know me well enough to know that's the only way I operate. Garrett is not here. The ceremony is not going to happen today. I don't have answers yet, and I won't pretend otherwise. There's food and there's an open bar, and if you want to stay and just be together for a while, I'm grateful for that. If you need to go, I completely understand. I'll be in touch when I know more." The silence that followed was the second kind, the car accident kind. Then Claudette started clapping, just once, firmly, and several other people joined her. And it wasn't applause exactly, it was more like a collective exhale of respect. I stepped away from the altar. My legs carried me toward the side corridor because I needed 30 seconds where no one could see my face. I made it to the corridor. I put my back against the wall, and I pressed both palms flat against the cool plaster, and I breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. Diane! I didn't have to look to know the voice. Elliot. He'd followed me, or maybe he'd anticipated where I was going, the way he occasionally anticipated things in professional settings that surprised me. "I'm fine," I said, which was such an obvious lie that I almost laughed. "You don't have to be fine," he said. He wasn't close. He'd stopped a few feet away, giving me space in a way that felt deliberate and respectful. "You just did something extraordinary out there." "I addressed a crowd," I said. "I do that professionally." "You didn't fall apart in front of people who were waiting to watch you fall apart," he said. "That's not the same thing." I finally looked at him. Gray linen suit, no tie, the collar of his dress shirt open 1 button. He had the look of a man who had already decided something and was waiting to see if the moment was right to say it. "What do you know?" I asked. He was quiet for a beat. "I'm not sure this is the right place." "Elliot." My voice was flat and even. "What do you know?" He exhaled slowly through his nose. 3 months ago, a financial attorney I know reached out to me about a real estate transaction that had my name adjacent to it in a way it shouldn't have been. A property in Northern Virginia. A transfer of funds through a holding company. The attorney wanted to flag it because something about the paperwork looked irregular. I pulled it. I looked at it and... He paused. The signatures were mine, or they were meant to look like mine. They weren't. And the holding company traced back to a partnership between Garrett Finch and Terrence Holt. I felt the corridor tilt slightly. Not physically, but the way your understanding of a room can shift when you realize the thing you were looking at isn't what you thought it was. "They forged your signature," I said. "They attempted to," he said. "My attorney caught it before it finalized. I've been working with her quietly for the past 10 weeks. I didn't tell you because I didn't have complete information, and I wasn't willing to..." He stopped. "I wasn't willing to hand you a suspicion when I wasn't sure what the full picture was." "How much?" I asked. "The transaction they were trying to route? About $340,000. But Diane," he stepped forward and his voice dropped, "that's not the whole thing. That's just what I found. What my attorney found when she kept pulling threads is that Garrett and Terrence have been running a side operation for at least 4 years, skimming from client accounts. Small amounts, consistently, over a long period. The kind of thing that's designed to stay invisible. 4 years. I stood in that corridor in my gray linen slacks, and I thought about the Bordeaux from France, the candles on the dinner table, the way Garrett had looked at me in February and said, "I want to choose you again." I thought about what it costs to plan a vow renewal for 200 people. I thought about who had suggested the venue, who had insisted on the specific caterer, who had managed the budget. "He used the renewal as a cover," I said. It wasn't a question. The pieces were assembling themselves without my permission. Elliot's expression confirmed it before he spoke. If they were planning to disappear, to liquidate and move on before anything caught up to them, a major public event would have given them a useful window. Everyone focused on the celebration. Financial accounts you might not review for weeks afterward because you were in the middle of a life event. I pressed my fingers against my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then I dropped my hands. "Your attorney," I said, "is she still working on this?" "She never stopped," he said. "Her name is Margot Veen. She's in D.C. She's very good. And she's been waiting for me to give her a green light to move forward formally." "Give her the green light," I said. Something shifted in Elliot's face. Not surprise exactly, more like relief, the way it looks on someone who has been holding a door open and finally sees the person walk through it. "There's something else," he said, and his voice shifted into the register that I had come to recognize over 3 years of working together as the one he used when something mattered more than he was letting on. "I need to show you something. Not here. It's at my office. Can you come tomorrow morning?" I looked back toward the main hall. I could hear the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, 200 people navigating the wreckage of an afternoon they had dressed up for. Somewhere outside, in the brutal July heat, Garrett and Terrence were in a car together, or on a plane, or sitting in a parking lot 3 miles away, having a conversation I was apparently the last person in the world to be allowed to know about. "What time?" I asked. 8, he said. "I'll be there at 7:30, I said. He nodded once. Then, because he is Elliot Marsh, and he has a particular quality of knowing when to speak and when to leave a silence intact, he didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back toward the main hall, and I stood alone in the corridor for another 60 seconds. Then I straightened my spine, and I walked back in to say goodbye to my guests. Claudette stayed until midnight. We sat in my kitchen, the kitchen of the house Garrett and I had shared for over 2 decades, and she made tea neither of us drank, and I told her everything Elliot had told me in the corridor. She listened without interrupting, which is rare for Claudette, and which told me how serious she understood this to be. "So he was planning to leave," she said. "Not just the marriage, everything." "It looks that way," I said. "And Terrence was either the reason he was leaving or the partner in the financial scheme, or both." I wrapped both hands around the mug. "I don't know yet which came first. I'm not sure it matters for the immediate question." "What's the immediate question?" "What's in my accounts?" I said. "What's in our joint accounts? What he had access to that I haven't looked at recently because I was planning a party." Claudette was already reaching for her phone. "Do you want me to call your bank tonight? You can freeze joint accounts pending." "I already did it from the parking lot before I left the venue," I said. "I called the bank on my cell while Wren was loading the centerpiece flowers into her car. Joint checking is frozen. I need to talk to a financial advisor tomorrow about the investment accounts, but those require both signatures to move, so there's a window." Claudette looked at me for a long moment. "You did that from the parking lot." "I was a photographer for 25 years, I said. "You learn to shoot even when your hands are shaking." She laughed. It was a short, startled sound, genuine and a little broken, and I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become relief eventually, the way a bruise has to darken before it can fade. I slept 3 hours that night. I know this because I watched the clock at 2:14 a.m., and then at 5:08 a.m., and at 5:30 I gave up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my phone beside it, going through every financial account I had access to, building a list of what I could see and what I couldn't, what was intact and what had gaps I didn't have explanations for yet. By 7 a.m., I had 4 pages of handwritten notes and a very clear picture of the fact that there were 2 investment accounts I had not looked at closely in over 6 months. 2 accounts Garrett had set up early in our marriage, and which I had, over the years, more or less handed over to him to manage. I had access. I had always technically had access. I had simply stopped looking, the way you stop checking the oil in a car that's always run fine. Both accounts had been drawn down to near zero. The larger one, a joint investment account we'd opened in 2009 with an initial deposit of $85,000, which by any reasonable estimate should have grown to somewhere between $180,000 and $200,000 over 15 years, showed a current balance of $4,217. I sat with that number for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the first birds were starting up in the backyard, in the garden Garrett had tended obsessively every summer for 20 years. I was at Elliot's office at 7:28. Margot Veen was already there. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and the kind of focused stillness that I associate with people who have seen a great many situations that other people would describe as unprecedented. She shook my hand and said, "I've been waiting for this meeting for 10 weeks. Let's get to work." What she laid out over the next 2 hours was thorough enough to make my 4 handwritten pages look like a grocery list. She had transaction records, correspondence trails, shell company registrations in Delaware, and a timeline of transfers that started 4 years ago and escalated sharply in the last 8 months. Garrett and Terrence had been systematically redirecting funds from 3 client accounts, including, it turned out, a portion of Elliot's retainer payments to my studio, which was why Elliot's name had appeared on the paperwork, into a holding company called Eastfield Capital Partners, LLC, which existed solely on paper at a registered address in Reston, Virginia. "The total we've identified," Margot said, tapping a page in the folder she'd set in front of me, "is approximately $1.2 million across all affected accounts over the 4-year period. Your joint investment accounts account for roughly $190,000 of that. The remainder belongs to their clients." I looked at the number. $1.2 million. I thought about the candles at the dinner table in February, the saved bottle of Bordeaux. "I want to choose you again." "He was buying time," I said. "The renewal was meant to buy him time." "And goodwill," Margot said, without softening it. "A wife who's just celebrated her marriage publicly is less likely to be scrutinizing joint accounts." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right then. "What's the current status?" I asked when I could. "I filed a report with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit 8 days ago," she said. "I was waiting on one additional document to make the filing complete. I received it Friday." She paused. "Yesterday. The day of the vow renewal. The day Garrett had apparently decided was the right moment to disappear. He may have known," Elliot said quietly from across the table, "or suspected, if Terrence had a contact who flagged something." "It doesn't matter why they ran," I said. "What matters is whether they can." Margot allowed herself a very small, very controlled smile. "They cannot," she said. "The FBI placed a hold on Eastfield Capital Partners accounts Friday morning. Garrett's personal passport was flagged at 11 a.m. yesterday. Terrence's was flagged 2 hours later." She folded her hands on the table. "They didn't make it out of the country. As of this morning, both of them are in federal custody in Northern Virginia." The room was very quiet. I looked at my hands on the table, the hands that had frozen the joint accounts from a parking lot the afternoon before, the hands that had shot 3 gubernatorial inaugurations and talked a drunk groomsman down from a chandelier. Steady hands, practical hands. "I want to be in the room when they're formally charged," I said. Margot looked at me. "You won't be in the room for the arraignment itself, but there will be a moment, if you want it." She paused. "The lead FBI agent is a woman named Darla Hutchins. She suggested that a brief meeting before the formal proceedings, with both defendants present, might be useful for the record. Victim impact, voluntarily given." "Set it up," I said. It happened 3 days later, in a federal building in Alexandria that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and recycled air. Margot came with me. Elliot offered, and I told him I appreciated it and that I needed to do this one on my own. He accepted that without argument, which was exactly the right thing to do. Garrett looked smaller than I expected. I don't know why I expected otherwise. He was wearing his own clothes. They hadn't been processed yet for holding, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which was fair, because neither had I. He wouldn't meet my eyes when I walked in. Terrence, to his credit or discredit, met them immediately. There was something calculating in his expression even now, as if he were still running numbers, still looking for an angle. I had thought, in the days leading up to this moment, that seeing him would clarify something for me, would answer the question I kept circling. When exactly did this start? Was any of it ever real? I looked at him and understood that the question didn't have an answer that would help me. Some things are built on sand from the very first brick. The only useful fact is that the building is gone. Agent Hutchins gave me 3 minutes. I spoke directly to Garrett because he was my husband and because he had stood at a dinner table in February with candles and a bottle of wine and said the words, "I want to choose you again," while already knowing exactly what he was choosing. "I built a life with you," I said. "I built a business, I built a reputation, and I built what I believed was a marriage. I did that with full effort and full trust. You used that trust as a financial instrument. You used our vow renewal as cover for a theft, and then you disappeared from the parking lot of the venue where 200 people were waiting because you didn't have the decency to look me in the face. I paused. You will not receive another word from me after today. Not through attorneys, not through mutual friends, not through anyone. My attorney will handle everything that requires a response. This is the last time I will speak to you directly, and I want you to understand that what I'm about to say is not anger. It's a conclusion. You spent 29 years with a woman who was worth more than you knew what to do with. That's going to be the thing you carry. Garrett finally looked up. His eyes were red. I didn't feel satisfaction at that, and I didn't feel softness either. I felt finished. I turned and walked out without looking at Terrence again. Margot followed me into the hallway. She put a hand briefly on my shoulder and then removed it, which was exactly the right amount. "That was well done," she said. "I know," I said. The legal process, as legal processes do, took its time. Garrett and Terrence were formally charged with wire fraud, conspiracy, and securities fraud. The federal case moved with the particular glacial efficiency of institutions that are thorough rather than fast. Margot filed civil claims simultaneously, targeting the Eastfield accounts that had been frozen and any personal assets not already liquidated. The divorce filing happened 6 weeks after the arraignment, no contested hearing, because Garrett's attorney and mine reached terms in a single mediated session, in part because Garrett's options were limited by the circumstances, and in part because what remained to divide was less than either of us had expected after years of quiet hemorrhaging. I got the house. I wanted it. Not for sentiment, I was clear-eyed about that, but because I had earned it, because my money was in those walls as much as his, and because I was not going to be the one who left. I repainted the kitchen in November, a dark, warm green that I had been thinking about for years, and that Garrett had always vetoed as too bold. It took me a Saturday afternoon, a roller, and a podcast I'd been meaning to listen to. When I finished, I stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the walls and thought, this is mine. This specific, unremarkable, completely mine kitchen. The financial recovery was partial and slow. Between the civil settlement, the frozen Eastfield accounts, and the restitution ordered as part of the criminal proceedings, I recovered approximately $140,000 of the $190,000 that had been taken from our joint accounts. It wasn't everything. Margot told me early on not to expect everything, and I appreciated the honesty. The other clients affected by the scheme had their own claims, and the math of what remained after legal fees and asset liquidation was what it was. I was 51 years old with a studio, a reputation, a client list, and $140,000 I hadn't expected to have. I had started over from worse positions. Ren stayed. I had worried in the weeks after the wedding that the association with the chaos would affect the business, that clients would distance themselves from a woman whose marriage had collapsed so publicly and so dramatically. What happened instead was something I hadn't predicted. The story got out, the way stories do. And it turned out that what people saw was not a woman who had been humiliated. What they saw was a woman who had frozen her own accounts from a parking lot in a cream silk dress and then walked back into a room full of people and told the truth, standing up. 3 new clients reached out in August. 2 of them referenced the story directly. Elliot and I had dinner in September at a restaurant in Georgetown that neither of us had chosen for its atmosphere. We talked about the Alexandria project, about 2 new proposals he was considering, about a historic property in Annapolis that he thought might be interesting for the kind of long-form documentary photography work I'd been wanting to do for years. At some point, the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when the professional scaffolding is solid enough that you can set it down for a minute. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," I said. "That moment in the corridor," he said. "When you asked me what I knew, you weren't asking me to fix it. You were asking because you needed the complete picture before you could act." "Yes," I said. "Most people in that situation ask someone else to act for them," he said, "because it's easier." "I'm aware," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the thing I've been trying to figure out how to say for 4 months. That I was watching someone handle the worst possible version of a day, And I kept thinking that I had never met anyone who made me want to be more useful. Not more impressive, more useful. He paused. That's a strange thing to say. It's not strange at all, I said. We stayed for another hour and a half after the check came. The restaurant was nearly empty by the time we left. Outside, the September air was finally cooling down after the brutal summer, that particular quality of early fall in D.C., where the heat breaks all at once, and you remember that the year has other seasons in it. He walked me to my car. We stood there for a moment on the sidewalk. Nothing was resolved, and nothing needed to be, not that night. Some things take the time they take. I had learned over the past few months to have more patience for the incomplete picture, not the willed blindness that had cost me so much, but the genuine patience that comes from knowing you have the capacity to handle what comes next. I'll see you Thursday, I said. The Annapolis property. 7:30, he said. I'll be there at 7, I said. He smiled. It was a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there, unhurried, like something that has nothing to prove. I drove home through the dark. The house was lit from inside because I had started leaving lights on, a small habit that cost almost nothing and made coming home feel different than it used to. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the lit windows. 29 years is a long time to spend building something. Long enough that when it comes apart, you can spend weeks trying to figure out what remains. What I found, when I finally stopped looking for the wreckage and started looking at what was still standing, was more than I expected. A business that was mine alone. A house with dark green walls in the kitchen. Friends who had stayed, and one who had known when to speak and one who had known when to listen. And a studio manager who had handed me information I hadn't wanted in a corridor outside a dressing room with her phone held face down like it was something fragile. And the knowledge, the specific, hard-won, expensive knowledge that I had never needed someone to stand at an altar for me. What I needed, what I had always needed, was to be standing there myself, fully present, eyes open.